All right, the next paper is mine, so I'll begin. I want to talk today about missions. I've been working on them along with other people for about the last 35 years and thinking about them when not in the field, certainly. I want to first begin by talking about the importance of the Florida missions. As you can see, we are the earliest in North America. You probably thought it was California. Most people do, but it's not. This is what it looked like on paper, on a map, basically. And the mission system actually extended from St. Augustine after a brief Jesuit period that was unsuccessful. The Franciscans came in the 1570s, ministering first in the area around St. Augustine, because St. Augustine itself was not a particularly safe place to live. It was sacked by Drake, and in 1587, when 12 new Franciscans arrived, they were simply rebuilding the town. So in the 1590s, in the mid-1590s, we see really the beginning of an outreach from St. Augustine up the coast to minister to some of the Timucuas, the saltwater Timucuas basically, and Ocamas, and then up into Wally, which is now the Georgia coast. Also, missions extended into Florida and into interior Florida as far south as really just a little south of Ocala among the Aquara, then up into Gainesville with the Patano, Lake City with the Utina, and across to the Ustaga. And that brings us to the Aucilla River and the beginnings of Appalachia. So I want to just talk a little bit about the mission sequence in this area. I basically have divided it into three parts based on events that occur. And we do have missions that we have excavated, that we have investigated over long periods of time that are affiliated with each of these periods. The earliest site we know about is San Pedro y San Pablo de Patali, or the Patali mission. It seems to have been founded probably in 1634. They come in 1633, but it's October. And the feast of Saints Peter and Paul is in, I think, June. So possibly, if this mission dates its inception from that time, it would have been in June of 34. And the early period ends with the revolt, 14 years later, basically. The middle period, they rebuild the missions. Unfortunately, the Carolina colony is founded and slave raiding begins. It has begun already from Virginia, but it hasn't reached this far south. San Luis is a really good example of this time period. San Luis in its second location, which is the one we all visit today. And finally, the late period, when the missions were really under threat and ultimately destroyed. And both San Luis and the O'Connell site, which is sometimes called Patali II, but simply can't be because of the artifacts, this is basically the way I would divide the mission period. There are some significant dates that we can get through. The first contact with Franciscans seems to have been in 1608, and the Appalachians expressed interest. But the reason the Franciscans were interested was because there was a state of war between Ustaga, east of the Aucilla, and Appalachia, west of it. And so settling that state of war was really one of the first things that permitted expansion of the missions in the future. The Appalachians did ask for missioners. They sent the nephew of the paramount chief to St. Augustine to kind of render fealty, but nothing happened for 25 years. I mean, there were contacts in between, but not very much. So in 1633, Franciscans come. They come without soldiers to support them, and they establish 7 or 8 missions. The revolt that I mentioned already occurs about 14 years later. There has been unrest, and it also is exacerbated by non-missionized neighbors, like the Chiscas, for example. Unfortunately, the governor's lieutenant and his family and 3 Franciscans are killed during this revolt. And in recompense, 12 chiefs are executed, and over 24 are kind of remanded to St. Augustine for hard labor. We don't know, because the Spaniards apparently weren't concerned with this, what kind of impact this would have on the social system, really, of the Appalachians to lose so many leading men, essentially. Finally, the destruction of the missions in this area is accomplished in 1704, and at this point, the population is really down to a few thousand, really, from an earlier 20 to 30,000 estimate. So I thought today I would talk about these kinds of things: how we identify sites. Is there a plan for missions? What have we learned about individual missions? What can we say about ethnicity at missions? And do we have a chronology for the sites that we've identified? And then what have we learned? So, in general, it's been a combination of things that have identified missions. Sometimes it's just somebody has found stuff on their property and they come in with it. Other times, I-10 went through, and one or two missions were identified at that time in the late 60s and, early 70s. Sometimes using Mission San Luis, because the location was never lost, is a way to kind of project from the lists of missions and the relationship of official visitors when an archaeological site is found with 17th century materials, which mission that might be. And that has worked, but maybe it hasn't worked so well. But the best indicator of whether you have a mission site is finding the church with its subfloor burials. This is the burial pattern in missions. So this combination of burial pattern, church, essentially, and the 17th century goods is the way we can tell. All right, so this is the Florida mission chain that we're interested in. It's really easy to put dots on a map. It's a lot harder to find them. So these are the sites we know about, that we assume are missions. Some of them have been given names, others have been given owners' names. I think that's really a better thing to do. Most recently, the Bryan site, which may be San Antonio de Bacuqua, has been found by the landowner, essentially, on his property. Now, I'm sorry about all the writing, but these are the sites we know about, and also what has been found there. And the reason I point this out is because we have a number of missions, at least 3 or 4 of them, where we have not found the church and subfloor burials. So it's not really clear to me that we have been confidently identifying these. And that would include the Castro site, which may be Santa Cruz de Capoli, the Bryan site, again, Bacuqua, the Pine Tuft site, which is supposed to be San Juan de Aspalaga, and also the Scott Miller place, which no burials were found there, but now there is some discussion as whether it's really San Francisco de Oconee, as Smith thought in the 40s, or whether in fact it's Ayubale, which Morell and Jones thought in the 70s. And of course, San Josep de Ocuya, we don't have a church there either. So it's not really clear to me that all of these sites are missions. I suspect they are, but we really need to do the job to show them. I'm going to show you now a series of mission lists, always a formatting issue. Anyway, this is basically the first group of missions. There are 8 or 9, and then we go to the mission list of a couple of years later, and we're at about 10. And finally, this mission list, again, a formatting issue, of 1647, when there's a visit by Bishop Calderon, and we have 13, and this is probably the upper level. All right, finally, this 1690, which shows you which missions actually have resident friars. And it looks to me, maybe naively, that some of these guys are kind of buddying up, perhaps because they feel vulnerable. I'm not sure, but anyway, there are very few missions that actually, at this point, still have resident friars. So are there other missions to identify? This is the Winewood site. It has been identified as a Fort Walton site, but if you see this burial pattern, this is a mission burial pattern. So I really think that Winewood is a mission site, and I don't know that today we could do anything about it. Another question, is there a mission plan? This is San Damiano in Italy. This is the first church that is so very important in Franciscan hagiography. This is the church where Francis receives his call, and it is the church that he renovates. And it is really a rectangle with a round end. So the apse is rounded, but the rest of it is just a big, what we call a hall church. And so I'm going to show you one from Gran Quivira in New Mexico, and you can see that we have a slight transept here, but in general, we have a long hall church. The other structures next to it are the convento, essentially. We don't see that here. In places where the churches are built of adobes or stone, they oftentimes have a common wall. Here we try to keep the fire and things of that sort farther away, and we find that there tends to be a distance of about 30 to 32 meters between church and convento or rectory. This is from the Yucatan, which also shows the kind of adaptability of the Franciscans. This is one that would be commonplace in the countryside. So what they've done is to build a chancel and sacristy out of limestone and blocks and kind of stucco over the blocks. And then they've just added a Maya house to it as the nave, essentially. Now, the convento is separate because, again, there's cooking and things of that sort going on, and you need to keep the fire in a distance. All right, so here we come to Appalachia Province. This is Mission Vitaly, and you can see in the nave a bunch of burials. This is the area that Calvin exposed in 1971. And when we continued work there in '89, we were able to show that, in fact, it was a much larger structure, that the area that Calvin thought was a convento was actually the sanctuary of the church, and also underneath it, there is an earlier structure that apparently was dismantled. And this was our first clue that there was dismantling, basically, and remodeling of the village, that it was an extant village. This is the other one. This is about 150 meters northwest, but if you drew a line through the church, it would be perpendicular to that line, about 150 meters away. But what we have here originally, at the very outset, there is this round structure made of red unfired clay, just tamped clay, basically. It apparently is dismantled, and then we have they basically brought in a big fill episode of yellow sand that probably came out of Lake Lafayette. That's the northern reaches of where Lake Lafayette once was. And then they built this two-cell structure on top, which is kind of a St. Augustine plan house. Both sides are relatively equal, and this flooring was so dense that actually roots did not penetrate it, so that when we excavated it, we literally took the root mass off the top and we were on the 17th century surface. So this is the church at Mission San Luis, which many of you have visited. If you haven't, I think it's a great thing to visit the reconstructed parts of the mission there. But you can see that it's not a small structure. This is the plan of the mission, so you can see that the sanctuary is at one end, the main door at the other. Burials beneath the church floor tend to be buried in a supine position, in other words, on their back, fully extended, hands over the chest, oftentimes perhaps holding something. It's not always clear. They're probably shroud burials, but their feet are pointed toward the altar. So in the nave, everybody is buried with their feet toward the altar, so if they sat up, they would be facing the sanctuary. In Spain, it's not uncommon to bury the priest the other direction, so that he faces his congregation. This is the mission plan for Mission San Luis, the area of the church, which we looked at. The convento, which is about 32 meters distant, a covered way of about 12 meters, and then the cocina, a structure that's been interpreted as a kitchen, essentially, but probably was a multi-purpose building for storage as well as for cooking and food preparation. This is the O'Connell site, also called Vitaly II. Calvin excavated structure 1, which he thought was a church, but again, one of the things that was bothersome in really beginning to work on missions was we had a lot of ideas about what we were going to find, and many of them were simply not observable, not fruitful, and as a consequence, we've really changed our opinions, our interpretation about a lot of things. In any event, the convento and the church, just as at Mission San Luis, parallel each other. And also you can see the beginnings of a third structure on the left side that we have a few posts. We were not able to finish that before the land was sold, so I have no idea. And we had several large trash pits, which have been incredibly helpful. We believe that this mission was occupied at least after 1670 and more likely after 1690. That makes it a very late mission, and it gives us an opportunity to really look at what the material culture of the Appalachians or whoever is living there is like late in the mission period. So this is another view. An interesting thing is that prior to working at O'Connell, we had never seen a cemetery outside of a church. And here we have one, and it's right outside the drip line. Those of you who don't have gutters on your roof eaves know that you get water that basically falls off, and it separates the soils nearby, so it's very clean oftentimes. So we have drip lines on both sides of this structure, and we know that we have burials outside. A lot of the grave pits tend to be small, and we think these are likely children. We only opened 2 of these, and we did it inside the church and 2 outside, mostly because we needed to know what the orientation of the body was. And then that let us know that the sanctuary of the area was on the southwest end of the structure, basically. So we have, I think, 150 burials inside the church, and we've excavated approximately half, and another 100 outside. Now, late in the mission system, people are dying. Ethnicity. Now, at Mission Vitaly, I feel fairly confident that we're looking at materials left by Appalachians. I don't have that confidence at the O'Connell site, because I'm just not sure who's there. And what we're hoping is that we can understand the ceramics and things of that sort, and maybe be able to say something about ethnicity. It's not always clear that ceramics indicates ethnicity. I'd be the first to admit that. So here are some of the people who actually were displaced and resettled in the Appalachia province during the mission period. So what have we learned? Well, one of the things we learned was when we first started, we were thinking, okay, we've got a nucleated Indian village with a mission in the middle, and it's all going to just be, tightly nucleated. Not so. That was the first thing we learned. We know that the Mississippian pattern at this time, and prior, in prehistory, was one of dispersed farmsteads, and we think that that is basically maintained, although the natives who lived in these farmsteads, the families basically, would have lived under the bell, so to speak. They would have been the congregants of a particular mission, and they would come there for holy days of obligation or other kinds of instruction and things of that sort. We also learned that the subfloor burial pattern is the one that really lets you know that you have a mission without any problem. Now, missions and visitas, the Mission Vitaly, San Luis, and the O'Connell site are doctrinas. This is where a doctrinaire, a person who's going to teach the catechism, is located. So a lot of the Franciscans, they didn't look at themselves so much as missionaries as teachers. And they're there to Hispanicize, to civilize the Appalachians and others as well. So this subfloor burial pattern is one that we see consistently. Right now, O'Connell is the only one outside, but I would also say that at Mission San Luis, there are burials outside the main door in what is possibly a little camposanto, a little sacred area just outside the main door. In other words, they're not all confined inside the church. There are some outside too. We also know that in the 1690s, actually in 1690, Don Patricio Hinachuba, who was the paramount chief of Appalachians at that time, complained to a Spaniard that the natives of Mission San Luis were no longer there. They were living a league away in the forest because the Spaniards had taken their homes. So at the very end, San Luis is not a mission anymore. It's a town and presidio, essentially. And the Appalachians are somewhere else. I don't know that now with all the construction on US 90, we would ever be able to find anybody. But it's interesting, you never know. We also, I think, have figured out that early missions had to fit into the villages, that the Franciscan came and he allied himself with a particular chief, an elite lineage, essentially, and they remodeled the village to put in the church and convento. And so we don't expect the earliest missions to really have this kind of plan that we see at San Luis and also at the O'Connell site. And that we do think that this pattern of a hall church essentially is the one that we're going to see throughout Spanish Florida. We've seen it everywhere so far. We also know that the greatest amount of material culture we're going to see in missions is made by indigenous people. It is not Spanish material culture. There is some, but it's not great. We also know that the most common kinds of European-derived materials are basically majolicas, iron, a lot of objects of iron, mostly nails and spikes, door hangings, things of that sort, and glass trade beads, which help us with chronology. Which brings me to the next question. Do we have any kind of chronology? So what I've done is to using majolica types make these kinds of claims, and obviously some of them are pretty broad. For example, the one at the bottom, San Miguel de Aucilla, middle to early, or late. That's not exactly the best. In fact, San Miguel de Aucilla is another problem in that the Aucilla mission was always known to be on the east side of the Aucilla. And for some reason, when Calvin identified this site, he called it San Miguel de Aucilla, and we are stuck with it, essentially. All right, here are some early mission period beads. Unlike the 7-row chevrons from Pensacola, these are 5 rows and tumbled Florida cut crystals, really pretty things. And using a lot of these beads, we can see that, for example, O'Connell has, and also San Luis, have a very different assemblages of beads from Vitaly, for example. We expect some heirlooming, we expect some overlap, but it seems to me that the majority in the later ones suggest that San Luis and O'Connell are later. And that's the best I can do with chronology at this time. We also know that the labor levies, and let me just talk briefly about the labor levies. At the very outset of missionization here, the Appalachians did not fall under the repartimiento. They did not send men for labor in St. Augustine and other places. They avoided it. But after the revolt, that was the outcome, that they would submit basically to the labor levies. And we also know that death from these kinds of contacts was great. We see that cemetery populations in our missions change. At Mission Vitaly, which is the early one, we have only 69 graves in the church, and of course later on in the O'Connell site we have over 200, and in and out. We know that the Appalachians got themselves into a system where they had rights. The Spaniards certainly extended to them rights, but they had no voice to activate those rights. And the life in this time, after 1690 particularly, was extremely stressful from just the threat of slave raiding. Now, we also know that the War of the Spanish Succession was one of the things that caused great strife between England and Spain and France. And this is one of the things that led Carolina militiamen and their Creek allies to simply raid here, and other dynamics as well. We know that many were enslaved by the South Carolina militiamen and planters. Some of them wound up in Barbados. Some fled to the Creeks before the raids. Some were enslaved by the Creeks. And a lot of them were simply left to fend for themselves when the Spaniards abandoned St. Augustine and went off. So were the Appalachians civilized? Yeah, they were. They had been in the mission system for 71 years. They spoke Spanish very well and other native languages. They were great traders. They dressed in the European style, and when they came to Old Mobile, some of them who fled to the French, they were received as good workers, good carpenters, good traders, and the French found a place for them to live. And they remained Catholics. In fact, they were demanding a priest very quickly. And also, I would say that the first depiction of mission sites has been that they were rustic and crude. But the size of the buildings and the kinds of things that we find, and also the documents, suggest far from that. So I would say that one of the things we've learned is that it takes a long time to work in a mission site. There's a lot less funding for that today than there was in the 80s and 90s when I was active with the field schools. And also that the current pace of development in this area, particularly in Leon County, but also in Jefferson, means that we're losing them and we're not going to get them back. A couple of things I wanted to say about research problems going forward. We've focused on the core of the mission, the church, the convento, the kitchen, and a few other things at Mission San Luis, which wind out being more, I think, Spanish structures than anything. But we haven't really been able to find the Appalachians on the landscape. It may well be that our surveys have shown us where they are, but we haven't, investigated those sites very well. And also, several missions on our list really need to be checked out more thoroughly. So that is my spiel, and let us have some questions and answers.